Okay, part three. I'm going to try to get through the rest of this if I can. I've had a lot of problems with the recording technology and getting the right formats and that sort of thing. So all these things will have to be worked out in the future. But I'll try to get through this and post it online in the Dropbox. So we talked about this. This could possibly be an early Gilgamesh story. It could be, it's contemporaneous with the Gilgamesh story in Mesopotamia, and being more archetypical, I even wonder if it could have been the origin. Anyway, going back to the civilization and what the archaeologists found, first thing that they found were tons and tons of toys, and they really were surprised because they're always expecting to find artifacts of war and conflict, and instead they found a society. They first wondered if it was a society of children. Jane McIntosh wrote this wonderful book, A Peaceful Realm, and she describes what's known from the archaeology about these people. And I love this image. I wonder if it could be animated into this Happy Feet video, which would be kind of cool. These are images from the stamp seals in the Indus Valley, and they undoubtedly have tremendous meaning, a lot of which we don't know. We don't know how to decipher the script that you see on some of the seals, and we don't really know what the imagery means. You pretty much have to assume you have to have some idea where they were coming from in order to interpret these images, and the interpretations are all over the place. But I think they are interpretable. I'm certainly seeing meaning in a lot of these patterns of consistent meaning, like this vessel shape seems to be indicative of the origin of the universe. And I'll talk a little bit about these 4 ticks on there. Many other spiritual symbols. A unicorn is a mythical creature, usually of some sort of divine presence. The bull in this example, very decorated, very worshipped, is a divine presence on earth, providing all kinds of benefits for the society. And so it's a very worshipped animal, but it's not a mythical animal. It's not in some ethereal realm. It's in this world providing benefits. Although then you see images like this, which is almost rhinoceros looking. So there are many questions, enigmas, and intriguing ideas. One of the things that interests me the most are the mythical creatures, and in this case you see chimerical figures where you have a fairly normal bull with additional heads, and these heads are obviously mythical heads. They're not meant to be material world aspects, since they don't normally conform to any animal that we know of. It's more common, in fact, to show the second one as a unicorn, and in this one with the horns in the opposite direction. Here they're probably shown in this direction simply because they wanted space to put what I think is a mathematical calculation. Talk about in a minute. Seals from Dolavira. So Dolavira is quite distant from Mohenjo-Daro and other cities along the Indus Saraswati area, closer to the coast. Could have been a port. The images in the Indus are uniform throughout many of these cities, so it indicates a fairly widespread civilization with a common belief system that's I should mention that these seals, if you saw the movie, you saw how they were used. They're little 2x2 seals with a handle on the back, or they're 2x2 clay steatite, actually, pieces with a handle on the back, and you press it into clay and then fire the clay, and this is used by merchants as to mark their goods. It's like a logo. It's like a company logo or a family logo. And just like today, where many logos adopt symbols that have deep meaning. You might have the image of an atom. Toyota has a bull. Subaru is the Pleiades. They were using logos from their spiritual culture to identify their goods and services and perhaps their businesses. The script, as I said, is considered undeciphered. There are people who believe that the Indus culture was a Vedic culture, and so if you make that assumption, then they can start interpreting many of these symbols. Richter Usanis is one of the people who's doing this, and it's very interesting work. However, it's also criticized a lot, and there are alternative views as to how to interpret. Again, we see the image I talked about before. We see an image of a woman probably praying. One arm is broken here, but certainly it came up into a prayer position. You see the swastika, which is an ancient symbol of spirituality and unity of nature and creation throughout all of history, and it shows up in nearly all religions. I'll talk about that a little bit. Other images of creatures, we don't know what's being said here. This fish is being eaten by an alligator. This fish symbol is one of the spiritual symbols that shows up on the seals, possibly indicating the origin of life, divine life, high consciousness, something like that. Here we have a yogi sitting in a yoga posture, obviously meditating, in keeping with the Vedic tradition. People have interpreted this as a man killing a bull. I don't think so. I don't think that would make sense to put these two images together here. To me, it makes more sense to say that the rishis who were divining knowledge from deep introspection were able to teach people how to domesticate animals. So it would make more sense to me, but it's speculative, and I don't have anything to support that really. So let's get in a little bit to the origin of the Vedas. There are two competing theories. One is called the Aryan invasion theory, and the other is the out of India theory. In the Aryan invasion theory, which has been the dominant theory for the last several centuries, Aryans, who were Indo-European, Caucasian, nomadic warriors from Central Asia or elsewhere, different people claimed that they were from Central Europe, Northern Europe, Scandinavian countries, even the Arctic Circle. In any case, they were speakers of an Indo-European language on which much of the idea was based. In fact, the people deciding that the Vedas were imported into India from some other location were saying that primarily on linguistic evidence that they were seeing. These people invaded the Indus Valley around 1500 BC, battling from horse-drawn chariots, as described in the Rig Veda. And the horses in the 1500 BC go together because you don't find evidence of horses in India prior to maybe 2000. And they weren't really prevalent until 1500. So if you tie those two together, then you get these dates. They conquered the region, subjugated the dark-skinned native population, the Dravidians, driving them south. Those remaining became lower classes. They established their language and Vedic philosophy, which formed the classic Vedic civilization from 1500 BC to 600 BC. As a result of this view, India's claimed spiritual heritage was explained not by the spiritual guidance of sages and rishis who formed a deeply introspective segment of society, but by intellectually superior white-skinned warriors who were also the ancestors of the Germanic people. So I think we're rapidly discrediting this entire story, and it was certainly the basis for a lot of the use of the swastika, for instance, in Nazi Germany, the idea of the Aryan people, the Aryan race. And it appears that the whole idea of Aryan was misappropriated. So in contrast, this out of India theory, which is being heavily promoted now by people in India, unfortunately, too much so by Hindu nationalists, so it becomes political and you sort of swing in the other direction, where India was the source of absolutely everything. Perhaps it was. in any case, in this theory, Rig Veda doesn't mention, we point out that the Rig Veda doesn't mention outside invasion or conquest. Sri Aurobindo, for instance, describes very clearly how the battles that are described in the Rig Veda are really talking about inner struggles that we have and using natural metaphors. And undoubtedly, some of them were historical, but the historical references and the natural metaphors were used to communicate a deeper meaning. Mm-hmm. Actual cultural conflicts are lesser than these greater forces, and often both sides are humbled by them. So there's a part in the Rig Veda where Indra, who is very powerful and spoken of all through the Rig Veda, conquers both sides that were squabbling in the local area. Rig Veda refers to the Saraswati River as the largest of 7 rivers flowing from the mountain to the sea. So paleoclimate studies confirm this now. And they show a large river before 3000 BC and a small seasonal river by 1500. So the idea that this whole culture started around 1500 doesn't make much sense when it so strongly worshipped the Saraswati River and called it the largest of all the rivers in the region, which wasn't the case at 1500 BC. Seals bearing obvious Vedic symbolism, which we'll see in a minute, date to at least 2800 BC. Most of them are coming from Mohenjo-Daro, but also from Harappa and Dolavira and other places with very similar imagery. There's a claimed find of a bronze head of Vashishta, who's a Vedic sage, dating to 3700. And astronomical references in the Vedas seem to date to 4000 BC. There was a continuous indigenous succession of cultures in the Indus Saraswati region since at least 7000. That's been established. I'll show some of the reports on that. But the Harappan civilization that really shows the strongest indication of Vedic philosophy started at 3300 BC. There are many claims of earlier Vedic civilization, including possibly coastal cities, which I mentioned before. These have to be confirmed. So who were the Aryans? Here's some quotes from leading authors studying this problem. There's no Dravidian race, no Aryan race. The two terms are used only in linguistic and cultural contexts. According to Max Mueller, who's in fact credited with starting the whole idea of the Aryan race, which he apparently didn't intend to do. There's several quotes from him saying that that's ridiculous. This is one of them. He said, there are Aryan and Semitic languages, but it goes against all rules of logic to speak without an express or implied qualification of an Aryan race, of Aryan blood, or Aryan skulls. You can't get more clear than that. And then Mark Kenoyer, who is the head of archaeology in Harappa. There is no archaeological or biological evidence for invasions or mass migrations into the Indus Valley between the end of the Harappan phase, about 1900 BC, and the beginning of the early historic period around 600 BC. And he's focusing on this time period, specifically speaking to the invasion theory of 1500, and he said that there was no invasion. So the Europeans appropriated the word Aryan from the Rig Veda. What did it originally mean? It originally meant noble, high-minded. It referred to the sages, the people who were doing deep meditation. And now genetic studies show that the Vedic people were mixed race, and it wasn't one race dominating or conquering another. The mixtures go back really far into prehistory, and there were two basic waves of migration along the south and through Asia and the north from Africa, and these met many times in India, and we have a mixing of the populations at various intervals. In fact, the genetic studies show that the mixing is so much that you can't use genetic signatures for ancestral North Indian and ancestral South Indian to identify race or culture or even caste or religion. So the divisions that are identifiable now genetically are a result of founder effects, not too long ago. In fact, the founder effect is when someone arrives in an area and you don't get migration of the gene pool outside of that. You don't get interbreeding outside. So there's cultural reasons why people stop mixing. And then the current divisions that are seen are a result of that and not a result of any social class or race or that sort of thing. So the looking again at this area and trying to reconstruct a little bit of a sense of time, the underwater archaeology indicates possible cities offshore, but certainly by 7,000 we're seeing an established culture in the valley. Pardon me. At Mehrgar. And very intriguing symbol at Mehrgar 7,000 years ago, which I think you'll see matches our four-quadrant system that shows up later in Harappan and Vedic culture as the swastika. There are some claims of a swastika being found 7,000 years ago in Greece. No, actually, Bulgaria, I think. But so we don't know. It could be that there was a introduction of the Vedic ideas, but it wasn't at 1500. It would more likely be at 3000 to 4000 BC. But that's entirely speculative. But now we have to get more data. So you can construct a timeline. There's a conservative timeline adopted by most authors who don't want to go too quickly away from the old theory, and a more aggressive timeline by mostly Indian authors, certainly taking the Rig Veda back to either 4000 BC, but even to 7000 BC. So in this emerging chronology, you have sea level rise from the Holocene ice melt at the end of the Pleistocene. So up to about 10,000 BC, you have oceanic settlements offshore, and those would have migrated inland as the cities were flooded and establishing cultures in the Indus Valley, and then eventually leading to the development of the more advanced Harappan civilization and the what was called the classic Vedic culture later. Interestingly, at 1900 BC, as we saw in the earlier climate change slides, the desert started moving in. The Thar Desert moved in and buried the entire civilization. We saw a degradation of society as a result, as well as physical forcing them to relocate. And from 1000 BC to the present, I think that's a period when we can identify the rise of Western duality, because it looks to me like this, and this is the case I'll make here later as we proceed, that it was a holistic thinking society in ancient times. So let's look at that a little bit now. There's three major creation myths that are very roughly identified by Alan Watts, for instance. The Western myth, I'll start at the bottom here, is dualistic, and its reality is made, like pottery or carpentry. And this began, we can say, roughly 1000 BC. Nobody knows exactly when Abraham existed, but these are the Abrahamic religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. Another great creation belief is represented in the Chinese Tao, where it's more organic. Life is grown, but also in cycles. This seems to have origins around 2700 BC. By far the oldest would be the Vedantic or the Vedic, which includes Buddhist, because Buddhism was derived from Vedic beliefs. As Alan Watts describes, it's Hinduism stripped for export. So that went to Asia and from various different divisions of Buddhism as well. But the Vedic, we've talked about the history of that, at least 3,300 to 4,000 BC, possibly quite older. And the reality belief here is like a play. Reality is like a play. We're actors on a stage. I'm going to have to pause here. modeling relation. This is the same relation, but now put into a category theory mapping kind of graphic mathematics, where each one of these arrows has a specific meaning, and we have mappings between sets, say, or categories. In fact, each hemisphere forms a category, because a category is technically consists of sets and morphisms, or elements and morphisms, so things that change, basically. So this is a change vector. This is like a force, and this is what we would normally consider material, not material cause, but efficient cause, but causality in the material world. So this is a law that causes the natural system to change in some way that produces a measurement, a state variable of some kind. So you notice that it changed the head of the arrow, that the solid arrows indicate the material world, the dashed arrows indicate this noumenal or non-local or informational world, or depending on what we're talking about, the spiritual world. So you can see a rather interesting cycle of causation here, which Aristotle missed because he had it as a hierarchy. If we look at some of the associations here, these are Aristotle's four causes, and there's Aristotle. This idea of a four-cause existence goes all the way back to the Rig Veda, and it shows up in Buddhism, four faces of Buddha. It goes back to, like I say, the Vedas, even the Rig Veda, four faces of Brahman. And I think we can see it in the Indus Valley. And we'll look at this chimerical bull figure as possibly exactly a representation of this four-quadrant cycle. There's also a study done by Ken Wilber, who looked at cultures and their cosmological beliefs. And he was looking for a common belief that they all shared, and he almost gave up on the project according to his book. But then he realized that the beliefs sorted themselves into four types. And so then he created this diagram of the four types. He didn't see the cycle, however. And in fact, to get his types to work, I had to exchange some of those quadrants. But what we've done now is we've said, okay, let's take that whole information domain, that whole non-local domain of origin, something that describes what can exist, and let's substitute scientists there. And now scientists will study the material causalities only. And so we have a tremendous blindness to these higher causes, and I think that's the reason for the division between hard and soft sciences. And we're sort of chopping off the mythical heads from the bull by doing that. I guess I could make a pun there, but I won't. So if we look at one of the oldest symbols of the four-cause existence, it's the swastika. And not only do you see in this symbol, which is on a 2x2 seal from the Indus Valley, not only do you see the four quadrants, but you see some indication of directionality, of movement. And by the way, the swastika appears in both orientations. So which direction we draw the cycle is arbitrary, except that there may be meaning to the opposite directions, the fact that they're opposite. And I'll talk about that in a bit. But in addition to the four quadrants and the sense of a rotation, you also have, in this particular one, they're not all drawn this way, an outside square with pointers into each of the four quadrants, as if to say there's a fifth level that is the unity of all of these. And that would correspond with the idea of the Atman. and Brahman, which is, in fact, the unity of these four. So the first thing is that we can't know anything about the ultimate existence, about the self or the origin of the universe. But the first thing that we can know is these four aspects of it. And they seem to cause each other and operate in a cycle. And why do they operate in a cycle? Well, who can say? This is one of the great mysteries. And so that's the fifth level, transcendent reality. And you see the swastika showing up through all of our cultural history in every religion, even Native Americans, Judaism, Buddhism, ancient Greece, Catholicism. It shows up everywhere. If we look at one of the seals from the Indus Valley, this is the yogi seal, and we start, I mentioned earlier that I'm trying to interpret some of these symbols. Of course, I can't claim to be correct. We don't have proof of what they mean, but there's such, if again, and we think in terms of Vedic belief, these diagrams appear to reflect Vedic belief almost like a textbook, because it's talking about this Aryan, the noble-minded, exploring reality with his inner thought. And this headdress on top is the people tree. That's the Bodhi tree, later called the tree of enlightenment for Buddha. And these leaves and that tree has been used as a symbol of high consciousness since early times. And this is a dividing line between a group of symbols here and a group of symbols here. And certainly this is associated with water and with rivers in a number of different graphical languages. The fish symbol, you know, as a symbol of Christianity today, probably associated with the origin of life or the divinity of life back then. And this, as I mentioned before, is a symbol of the universe and of creation. And I'm not just making that up. You see images in the seals where you have the divine goddess sitting inside of that vessel being worshipped by people outside. And so clearly being in the vessel, that's the divine person of the universe. And the original version of this has the four ticks, again, corresponding with the four quadrants of the swastika and many other images. So there's a great deal to be learned here. People even debated whether he was a yogi, whether this was yoga. Well, it clearly is. We even have this posture today, and it's taught in studios. This vertical position isn't taught very much. It's usually reclining. I tested this out to see if you could sit this way with the soles of your feet together, and when I did, it instantly fixed a misalignment in my back that had me almost crippled for a number of years. So I like it. 5,000-year-old chiropractor. But there's so much imagery here, and then we don't know what these tick marks on the arm are. One would assume from current thinking and Eastern science that these would be like bangles for tuning the energy of the yogi. But, I don't think we have any text to refer to on that sort of thing. Now, these symbols on the left, certainly Victor Usinus interprets it similarly to what my initial impression was, is that we're talking about material reality here. We've got sticks, and then the X is a symbol that seems to show up quite a bit with civilization. You know, we're putting together the material parts and building things. And this is a built-up world and material reality. And it's a duality. It's this non-local and local duality with consciousness in between. Can I prove it? No. It just seems to read that way. I think this is one of the most amazing figures, two unicorns, which are obviously mythical, obviously talking about some original essence in the universe. Again, the people tree. So we're talking about deep thinking, deep consciousness, the origin of existence. That's clear. We have the same dichotomy of symbols on the bottom, although I don't know much about these, although this one seems to correspond with the universal symbol. But a lot of we have to learn a lot. We need a Rosetta Stone to really get these symbols. But again, we see the possible division between a non-local original world of sort of universal principles of life and consciousness and that sort of thing, and then a well-defined material world, with carts and wheels, or perhaps that's the chakras and material objects. And so what are these two unicorns doing, facing each other through the unity of consciousness? Well, it's duality, and here's the unity. So I think this is a clear indication of duality and the possibility of a unity, a non-duality. And depending on how we're thinking and what our state of mind is, we're participating in one or the other. The Indus Valley three-headed seal, again, I can map that right onto our four-quadrant existence. We have the material world represented by the body of the bull, what actually exists in the world and is measurable. The force, the cause, the driver of the material reality being the head of the bull, which in this image is a realistic head, not a otherworldly head. What's above that in consciousness would be some sort of divine guidance, represented here with the unicorn, which is also a traditional symbol of Krishna, who provided divine guidance to Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita. And then what's going on here? Well, we have an obviously mythical head, like a scimitar oryx, which didn't occur in India. It was in Arabia and Africa, at least as far as we know. But in any case, the horns are reversed, so it's clearly a mythical head. And it's looking backwards, and the horns are reversed in the backwards direction. And very much like this holon that comes out of relational theory, this would be taking a material existence and taking that into a new context, into a new world, say. If I had a chair and I had it in my living room and I took it and I put it in the shop, it would have different uses, different functions. Or if I put it in the intertidal zone off of California, the barnacles would find different functions for it. So it's taking a material existence from one reality and putting it in the context of another one, from which we get the emergence of new functions. And this is why the cycle continues to generate itself. And so this is like karma. This is taking the results of prior actions and reinterpreting them and putting them into future action. I'll pause here for a minute.